Topic 2, the medical model. This is a poster that a student did a couple of years ago, and it's quite handy to just see the whole overview of the topic. The background does focus on those scientific leaning medical explanations of depression, very biological. And then we've got the Gottman key study that supports that idea, and then the applications, antidepressants and ECT being the two main ones. There's an extra one on there, antipsychotic drugs should you wish it, but antidepressants and ECT as our applications. How do we reduce mental illness from the medical model's perspective? Okay, so looking at these in particular, the monoamine hypothesis is all about levels of dopamine, levels of neurotransmitters. If I show you the this here, this is the presynaptic neuron, this is the postsynaptic neuron, but essentially to get those messages flowing around the brain, we need neurotransmitters like dopamine to pass the information along. Now, if there is too little dopamine, then that it creates an imbalance, and you could think of it as a kind of slowing down of the messages around the brain, and you can imagine how that would lead to depression. But there's different ways that the antidepressants deal with that, which is affecting the dopamine transporters, increasing the number of transporters, decreasing the number of enzymes that can break down these neurotransmitters like dopamine. So if I skip ahead down to the antidepressants, monoamine oxidase inhibitors, MAOI, prevent the breakdown of serotonin. So if I show you here, what happens to some of the dopamine is it gets passed along successfully to the postsynaptic neuron. The rest is reuptaked into the presynaptic neuron, so it goes backwards, which you don't particularly want, or you want a certain level of it, but not too much of it. So those antidepressants prevent the breakdown of that serotonin, stop it from being broken down in that postsynaptic neuron. And similarly, the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, SSRIs, are particularly geared towards that reuptake, to stopping the reuptake of those neurotransmitters like serotonin. So essentially, it's about trying to get the appropriate level of activity at the synapse and the healthy level of neurotransmitters passing across. Noradrenaline being key, serotonin being key in controlling noradrenaline and dopamine, all of those being really important. If you've got a reduced level of serotonin, then you're going to get abnormal dopamine and noradrenaline, and that's going to disrupt mood and activity levels. And that's essentially the explanation from a monoamine standpoint. You can do very well by just learning that sentence, really, because, yeah, it's all about that abnormal level. The dopamine hypothesis, high levels and excess of dopamine in parts of the brain, such as speech production, can lead to hallucination of voices. This is the theory. So this is dopamine hypothesis. Not necessarily in schizophrenia. It could be just a generally hearing hallucinations of voices, but that idea that too much dopamine in particular parts of the brain and low levels in the prefrontal cortex, so in that frontal part, the decision-making one, if you think back to Casey and the frontal gyrus, apathy, incoherent thought and speech, just not enough going on in that cognitive center, in the kind of control center of the brain, can lead to that apathy and incoherent speech. So a couple of different ones, but linked together, really, dopamine being a key aspect, monoamine particularly linked with depression. Genes and depression, we're getting onto Gottman really here, but serotonin transporter that we're talking about here, that produces serotonin, three forms, a gene, that produces serotonin. Three forms, the long, short, and short gene. The short form has been linked with inefficient serotonin production if you've got the short form of that gene, and that would make you less resilient to the effects of stress and more vulnerable to responding with stress for people with depression. So yeah, the three different types of it. If you've got the short gene, then insufficient serotonin production. So it's the same as the monoamine, but how you get those particular levels of monoamines come down to your genetic makeup according to this theory. Okay, genes and schizophrenia. Yeah, there's a little bit of that in the hallucination of voices part that we mentioned just there. So too much dopamine in the speech production areas of the brain. Genetic links in the family. I mean, to be honest, this stuff you can use Gottsman for. The kind of links, such as identical twins having a 48% chance. I would have a 48% chance of having schizophrenia if my twin brother had schizophrenia. So the idea of a schizophrenic gene as well, the schizo gene, people vulnerable to schizophrenia. However, number of genetic variations makes us slightly more vulnerable, according to the geneticists in this area. Ripke combined studies linking variations across schizophrenia and found an increased vulnerability to developing schizophrenia, including those coding for function number of neurotransmitters, including dopamine. So, essentially, genetic vulnerability and dopamine being linked together there, according to Ripke. So, Ripke's saying after looking at all of those studies, yeah, it looks like there is a link between your genetic vulnerability and your levels of dopamine. If both of those are lacking, then you might have an increased chance of getting schizophrenia. Brain abnormality, Coffey's MRI scans, frontal lobe in depressed patients more significantly smaller than in non-depressed patients. Melo with the PET scan, frontal lobes in depressed patients don't draw blood flow in the brain as they normally would. So it improves after ECT. Things like exercise that get the blood flowing to the frontal cortex. That's why people tend to feel better after doing exercise, even addicted to going to the gym sometimes. So, because you get that boost. But Coffey and Melo doing some brain scans there to back that up, either the volume in depressed patients or the blood flow. And then brain abnormality in schizophrenia. Juckle and the ventral striatum, we're familiar with the ventral striatum and the reward circuitry there from Casey, but higher levels of activity than those observed in controls, and negative correlation between activity levels in the ventral striatum and the severity of overall negative symptoms. So negative correlation, that would mean as your negative symptoms increased, your activity levels in the ventral striatum decreased. So negative symptoms being the loss of certain functions, right? So your loss of activity, your loss of speech, your loss of feelings of, those kind of things associated with depression. And that, as they go up, your level of activity in the ventral striatum goes down, which is interesting because Casey is saying the ventral striatum is big on reward circuitry and kind of where we feel good about eating the marshmallow and doing things, smiling at people and receiving smiles. So yeah, it kind of makes sense, doesn't it, that people who have got that lower activity aren't really feeling rewards, and that results in perhaps more negative symptoms, so things a bit lacking. Okay, and then Alan and the patients experiencing auditory hallucinations did a brain scan while the participants decided whether the recorded voice was theirs or not. There was lower activity in the superior temporal gyrus and anterior cingulate gyrus in the hallucination group. Okay, more errors made than the control group. Okay, so to be honest, if that confuses you, then leave it out. It's okay to leave out. But it is quite simply a way of showing that people's ability to, their decision making between, is that something I recognize or is that something that is somebody else's voice? There seems to be a difference there between those two groups, that those who are in a hallucination group have made more errors in those areas and have got lower activity in those areas. So it's quite simply a link between activity in particular areas of the brain and hallucination. Okay, so brain abnormality linked to schizophrenia. brain abnormality leading to depression in Coffey and Milo. Okay, so don't be too intimidated by all of that. Just pick out a couple of examples that you want to remember, and you've got some nice examples of the medical model explaining mental illness there. You won't need all of it, but yeah, cherry pick as much as you can. Gottman's study, I'm not going into a huge amount of depth on this. You kind of remember it. So remember, it's in Denmark, and you're identifying. They used 2.7 million Danish people, 196 couples with schizophrenia and their 270 children, and 83 couples who were bipolar and their 146. So straightforward study. You find lots of people with schizophrenia, lots of people with bipolar, and then you analyse whether the children have got it or not. So cohort study, natural experiment, comparing two or more naturally occurring groups. Yeah, the IV is parental schizophrenia or bipolar. The DV is the diagnosis of mental illness according to the ICD of the kids, whether the children have actually gained this. Okay, the results. If both parents had schizophrenia, there was a 27.3% of the kids who had it by 52, by the age of 52, and 67% had another mental illness. Okay, for one parent with schizophrenia, 7%, so that drops a lot if it's one parent, 11.9% for any diagnosis. And then neither parent, 1.12% chance of getting schizophrenia, 14% chance of mental illness. So that's essentially kind of the average of the population. Both parents bipolar. So for the depression one, so essentially just, quite a high chance of developing schizophrenia if you have both parents with schizophrenia. But equally, looking at evaluation, quite a large chance that you don't get it as well, actually. And the majority didn't get it. Both parents bipolar, 24.95% had it by 52, but had bipolar. 36% had bipolar or depression, and 44% other mental illness. And one parent with bipolar, only 4.4%, 9.2% other mental illness. You don't need to learn them all. Try and remember one or two of them, and then just a description of what that shows or what that finds, which is there in your conclusion. Okay. Your applications, antidepressants we've covered. Quite a bit of those. So those different ways in which you can affect the levels of monoamines in the brain. ARL investigated the effectiveness of antidepressants, and 56 to 60% improved. So it's a nice one to remember, ARL, as a kind of usefulness comment. ECT, it's an 800 milliamps shock, and the seizure lasts around 15 to 60 seconds. The 2 to 3 weeks, you have it 6 to 12 times over that period. And in the past, it would break bones and you get brain burns, but it's much more controlled under the NHS now. It's usually given under anaesthetic, so it prevents that those broken bones. And then one on antipsychotic drugs there, such as chlorpromazine, easy for me to pronounce, and dizziness, agitation, sleeplessness, weight gain, itchy skin. Long-term use can have central nervous center damage. So the other reason why I mentioned those ones, and it can be fatal, is that's a nice evaluation issue of the dangers of using some medication. However, it does calm people down and it allows people to work, and so it is seen by some as being human rights abuse, however, so it's a very controversial area. Your main two are understanding your antidepressants, or being able to describe a couple of the antidepressants, and then your ECT. Okay, so write them in your own words for each section and you'll be okay. All right, now there's a lot of kind of figures and a lot of numbers and a lot of, specific things there, but you write your own script. Okay, you pick out a couple of things that show, if someone asks you in the pub, is mental illness, biological? Where does it come from? A couple of things that you can say, well, there is this idea about monoamines, there is this evidence about brain abnormality, and if you've got a couple of examples of those from each one, you'll be fine. Okay, right, good luck.